All right, starting here. We've lost a beetle again. Back to our ants. Or no, is this a wasp? Zoom and enhance. I think this is a paper wasp, but it's actually showing us one of the identifying characters for paper wasps. So do you all see how that inner edge of the wing is very, very flat? Looks like someone took the wing and kind of folded it in half like a piece of paper. That is one of the things you can use to identify a vespid or a paper wasp. So all the little wasps and stuff that were building nests and things in the roof of the barn here, those were polistes or paper wasps. And so when you're in the field or looking at a pin specimen or whatever, that folded wing is a good character to kind of point you in this direction. They also have, we're not going to be able to see this from this view. The ants look like they've already gotten to the head, but the eyes on a vespid are notched. So the antenna is actually placed, like if you were to draw a full circle around the edge of the eye, the antenna would be included in that, but there's a little divot that kind of makes room for the antenna. And that's another defining characteristic that you look for when you're trying to identify paper wasps. And this is, if you're being technical about it, wasp on wasp violence. So ants and wasps are both in the order Hymenoptera, which means membrane wing, and things in that group, ants, bees, wasps, all that sort of thing, they are characterized by having that wasp waist, you know, like right behind the legs where the body gets really, really tiny and then kind of comes out again. And they also have little hooks on the front edge of the hind wing that when they are in flight, the wings hook together like little bits of Velcro, and then they can flap both wings at the same time, but only use one set of wing muscles for it, so it actually helps save energy. Yes. Thank you, Christy. You're right. Yes, I forgot about the U-shaped pronotum. That is also useful on paper wasps for identifying them. Christy, there in the chat, is an entomology friend of mine. She works on bumblebees. So who else do we have tonight? Quokka, yeah, that was really cool. That was a fun midday bug hunt. So for those of you that weren't on the wolf cams in the middle of the day the other day for whatever reason, we had a bee fly stop by, the family Bomboleidae, and they are a very cute, very fluffy, very fuzzy family of fly that looks and acts a lot like bees do, going to flowers. And behaviorally, you see them going from flower to flower, and they look very, very similar. But flies only have 2 wings, so they're in the order Diptera or Diptera, which, if you break down the Latin of that, di is 2, ptera is wing. So flies are the only insects that have a singular pair of wings. All other flighted insects will have 2 pairs of wings. So butterflies have a front and a back. Beetles, the elytra, or there's hardened modified wing covers, are those front wings modified into those wing covers, and the hind wings are the ones they actually use for flight. It was very, very cute. If any of you are familiar with Pokemon, Cutiefly and Rabombi were based off of this group. And, oh yeah, thanks, Wazix. Good, we've got a clip there for it. Going back. JDH8865 asked, do all wasps have stingers / venom? No.
Tooth Thefty subbed for 8 months.
Sounded real confident in that answer. That's a complicated answer, sort of. So, a stinger, which we know we've talked about before,
An anonymous user gifted a tier 1 sub to
is a modified ovipositor, or the modified egg-laying tube, or, in our vernacular, the modified straw ussy. And so what that means is that only females in the order Hymenoptera have stingers. So male bees, male ants, male wasps, they don't have that stinger. Oh, who did that? Who did that? Anonymous, thank you for the gifted sub to Christy. We appreciate that. So in that way, no, not all wasps will have a stinger, because half of the wasps, or I guess not half of the wasps, their sexual composition of the populations are different. But only females will have stingers. And even further than that, only some groups actually can sting. So aculeate Hymenopterans, which includes your ants, your bees, and most of the wasps that people are familiar with, things like paper wasps, those ones are the stinging group. But the vast majority of Hymenoptera, the big majority of the diversity in that group, comes in the form of parasitic wasps. So, we've talked about this before on previous chats when we're talking about hyperparasitism and parasitism in general. You know, when you have caterpillars that get the little wasp eggs laid in them and then they cocoon out and make those little white puff balls. Those are parasitic wasps. And the levels of parasitism, when the one parasite parasitizes the other parasite that's already parasitized the other thing, and we've talked about that going 7 layers deep. All of those are basically going to be parasitic wasps. And right now, as you all know, I am a staunch beetle lover. I will fight for beetles till the end of time. Beetles currently are the most described group of organisms on the planet. There are about 400,000 described species of beetles. And to put that in a frame of reference, there are only about 5,000 species of mammals worldwide. So, just like an insane amount of diversity there. And right now, Hymenoptera, the group that includes ants, bees, and wasps, is about 100,000 behind. So they're at about 250 to 300,000 described species of wasp. Now, this is a big controversial debate. You're getting in on some of the entomologist drama that happens. There is a big debate on what is actually the most diverse group. And the reasoning for a lot of people kind of having that thought is because there are so many parasitic wasps. For a lot of plants, there are insects that will specifically create galls and lay eggs in those plants. There are so many beetles that there could be a parasitic wasp hypothetically for each one of those beetles, and making their total of species numbers higher. That is, like I said, a debate that is happening right now, currently. The entomology community is rife with this at the moment. But I say, as a beetle specialist and someone who works extensively with beetles, Hymenoptera people, you gotta get describing species. I don't care if they're actually more wasps. You guys are 100,000 species descriptions behind, so they're gonna have to catch up there. Sydney Tree asked, are flying ants in the ant family or the fly family? So that's a really good question. They're ants. They're still ants. And obviously not all ants fly. In fact, most ants that people think about don't fly. But ants have a caste system. And so what that means is that there are different jobs that happen in an ant colony. So, like, you have the queen, you have workers, you have soldiers, you have, like, ones that tend to the babies in the group. Ooh, nice big darkling beetle here. Very, very fun. He's a little dirty, but he's exciting. So this is a darkling beetle. The family is Tenebrionidae. And so if any of you are familiar with like mealworms, like feeding to your reptiles or anything like that, mealworms are actually in this family. But mealworms don't turn into this in particular. There are many, many, many different species of darkling beetles. It's one of the like 10 most diverse families of beetle on the planet. And so in the US, I think we've got about 1,200 species, and worldwide there's about 20,000 species. So, again, beetles are incredibly, incredibly diverse. This is just one friend in the group, Tenebrionidae. And I forget who this is, actually, because I think we found one of these before, maybe on a bug hunt with Allison. And I sent who this is, but I think this is a species of Eleodes, which are also known as stink beetles. So these ones, this group of darkling beetles in particular, have very, very strong chemical defenses. And it doesn't hurt or anything. Like if you were to pick it up, it would spray it at you a little bit, but it wouldn't be hot, it wouldn't burn or anything like that. But man, it does smell real bad. If you go back to some of the Arizona streams, I think we had Maya sniff one of these at one point, or maybe we commented that we could smell them because other people were picking them up. But Eleodes are very hardy desert beetles. They have, predators that can eat them, but their chemical defense is actually very, very, very helpful in that way, in trying to get things to not feast on them. Handsome lad, bee person, scrolling back. Yeah, Roxer. So, Roxer Boxer 31 said, I have some ensign wasps, which are cockroach parasites, or parasitoids, in my home, and heard they don't sting, but they do have a stinger and can't sting humans, or just no stinger. So they do sting and oviposit inside of cockroaches. I've never been stung by an ensign wasp, and I don't know of anybody that has. But I imagine they could, like, poke you with the ovipositor, which, in all fairness, it is them defending themselves. They're trying to make that count. But I don't know if it would actually do much if it were to actually try to poke you with that ovipositor. Ensign wasps are pretty chill. I actually like those a lot because the family is Evaneidae, which has my name in it. So that's always exciting. Kzoom asked, are beetles carnivorous? No. The vast majority of them are not. So this is like a big evolutionary question that comes up a lot when you're talking about why beetles are so diverse. And beetles are broken up into 4 different suborders. So I know we talk about taxonomy a lot about this when I'm doing the chats, and not so much with Allison. But we talk about, the organization of kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. In beetles, because they are so big, we have suborders, which are between the order and the family level. And so beetles are divided into 4 suborders. 3 of them are pretty small. There are like 165 different families of beetles, and 16 of those are in those 3 small suborders. The vast majority of beetle diversity, like so much of it, is in the suborder Polyphaga, Polyphaga. And if you break that down, poly means many, and phaga means eating. So Polyphaga are the plant feeders, and they feed on a lot of different things. And if you look back at when beetles were diversifying and, evolving in the Jurassic period-ish, the diversity of insects, and specifically the diversity of beetles, coincides with the angiosperm radiation. So all of your flowering plants got really, really diverse during that time period. And as all of these new plants were evolving and coming around, all of these new beetles and all of these new insects went, oh, that's a new food resource that, Joe Schmo over here to the left is not focusing on, so I'm going to make that my thing. And so you have this massive group of beetle diversity that focus on feeding on plants, basically. So that's evolved away in some of those groups where they go back to being predatory. But you have massive families like leaf beetles, which are insanely diverse. They're found all over the world, and a lot of them can be traced to individual plants, like host plants. I've gone about it a couple times in the field where I have found an insect on a certain plant, took a picture or brought the beetle back, and was planning to look at it under a microscope, but then I asked our botanist what the plant was, and she identified it for us, and then we went, oh, well, this species of beetle is known to feed on that plant, and sure enough, it matches. So very, very cool. Beetles and insects in general kind of co-evolved with plants, and specifically the diversity really, really spiked up when flowering plants kind of came to be. So to answer that question shortly, no, not all beetles are predatory. In fact, the vast majority of them are not. However, the incredibly biased and informed by my own very correct opinion is that ground beetles, carabids, those ones are in fact one of the majority predatory groups. So I think some of the coolest beetles are predatory. Again, like I said, in my very biased opinion. I can't really tell what our friend here is munching on. Tenebrionids are general detritivores, so they will feed on other dead insects, but they will also feed on downed plant material. So he could just be gnawing on a piece of hay or something that one of the, Winnie or Sarah or the donkeys or somebody dropped, but I can't really tell from this angle. Can different species of beetle produce offspring? And if they do, would that be considered a new species? That is a hard-hitting question on my beliefs on what makes a species a species. In general, no. So we talked about it a little bit recently with the donkey stream that we did the other day, talking about horses and donkeys mating to make a mule. Hybridization does occur in insects sometimes. 2 separate species generally have to be in the same genus to be able to reproduce together. But it's really hard to find that in natural conditions. So you could test that in a lab somewhere, and then the offspring would have to be tested to see if they were independently fertile, which they very likely would not be. And speciation doesn't really work like that. Speciation is a many, many, many hundreds of thousands of years, or long stretches of time process that usually comes from some sort of environmental cue, or breaking into a new habitat, or vicariance, or some splitting with like a geographic barrier that prevents populations from mating with one another. But just a simple hybrid between two beetle species does not create a new species on its own. Okay, what do we got? Scrolling back up. Oh, Nicole. Nicole's here. Hello. Would you say that this time some of these plants have a very symbiotic relationship, or they're obligate angiosperm beetle symbioses? Angiosperm and beetle symbiosis, I'm sure there have to be some out there, like magnolias. Magnolias are a really good example. Those are some of the earliest angiosperms, and their flowers are really, really, really big. And so some of the things that pollinate, and the primary pollinators of magnolias, are going to be things like scarab beetles. And so you have this really big, fleshy, chunky flower because it needs a very long or very big landing pad basically to support those scarab beetles that do that. So angiosperms with beetles, that's a really good example that comes to mind. But beetles generally aren't one of the things that we think about when we talk about insect-plant interactions. Obviously, we're thinking about pollinators in this aspect, right? So that's a known group. We're building the garden for it, which is going to be very, very exciting. But we're going to be looking at and looking for those plant-insect interactions. And some of the most famous ones are going to be things like Darwin's hawk moth, which is a very large species of sphinx moth, and its proboscis is like 14 inches long. And this was something that he hypothesized about, where he found this orchid that had an insanely long, like foot-long nectary, that the reward for insects going to flowers is nectar or pollen generally. And so for something to be able to get the nectar all the way down the end of this really long tube, Darwin hypothesized, like, hey, we have never seen this thing, but in order for this flower to work, there has to be a moth that has a very, very long proboscis to get down there. And I don't remember how many years later it was, but eventually someone did find this orchid, or did find this moth that would go and pollinate this orchid. And that's another one of the things where we talked about last week, kind of the evolutionary arms race of like one thing evolving a trait in response to something else. And in this case, it wasn't to try to avoid it, it was to try to get a very specific pollinator. So there are flowers that can be pollinated by like anything, but there are some plants that get pollinated by very, very, very specific insects. And that orchid is one of them. Another one is actually chocolate. So chocolate trees, or cacao trees, produce a very, very tiny flower. And it's hard to pollinate that when you are of a general size. So the insect that pollinates the cacao flower is actually a very, very tiny fly. And that's one of the things where people bring up, oh, I don't like flies or whatever. If you don't like flies, you don't have chocolate. And that's a big thing for a lot of people. So it's in the family Ceratopagonidae. And yeah, it's a really, really tiny fly, and it's the only thing that pollinates the cacao tree. And I'll post that orchid and the the orchid and the moth in the Discord after we're done here. Okay, scrolling back. Oh, we've lost Cams. There he goes. Yeah, Wazix, that would be great. If we're down on Cams, clips would be awesome. Big Al, no, I have not been to the Galapagos. I would also really like to go at some point. The insects there are phenomenal, and just going to any new place and finding new bugs is very, very exciting. But secretly on the side, I'm also a birder. So going to the islands and trying to find all the different finches would be super dope. Also penguins and tortoises and all the other cool wildlife stuff that they have there. So I have not, but definitely on my list. Okay, let's see. Everyone open up the clip that Wazix just sent us. Let's see what we got here. Oh, it's a little skipper. Will you turn to the side for us? Oh, it's gone. Okay, so that was very cool. So that clip that was just sent was during our random midday bug hunt the other day, which was fun. But that insect that was there was a skipper in the family Hesperiidae. Now, it looked like a moth, or it looked like a butterfly, and you would be correct, sort of. They're in the same order. So Lepidoptera is the order for butterflies, moths, and skippers. If you follow Maya's streams, you have her little buggy backpack that we named Lepidoptera, based on that. And Lepido means scale, and Ptera means wing. So if you zoom in really, really far on a butterfly or moth wing, it's covered with these really fine scales. And that's what actually makes the color patterns on the wings and on the bodies of butterflies and moths. If you've ever handled a butterfly or moth and you've had that little bit of like dustiness that comes off, you've taken some of the scales off, which is not the best, but they can deal without it. Anyway, so skippers are like kind of the third classification of lepidopterans. They don't quite fit into butterflies. They don't quite fit into moths. So they're oftentimes grouped kind of as their own thing. I don't know what the current science is telling us about like where they fall in the big tree of relatedness in lepidopterans, but Hesperiids or skippers are really cool. They get their name because they do kind of skip from flower to flower. Like we said, that one was small, and it unfortunately never came back to any of the flowers that we could get the cameras back on. But they're called skippers because they will go to a flower, stop really quickly, and then jump off and move to another one. And so they skip kind of between flowers in the flower patches. And the way that you can tell a skipper from a butterfly, generally, not always, but generally, we think of moths as being nocturnal and butterflies as being diurnal, meaning they're active during the day. Skippers are also diurnal, so you're most likely going to see a skipper next to a butterfly. And the way that you tell most butterflies and moths apart is that moths will have feathery antennae that kind of flare out and come to a little fine point. The butterflies, on the other hand, have clubbed antennae. So a butterfly antenna kind of looks like a golf club. It's a long stick and then has like a ball kind of at the end of it. Skippers are closer to butterflies and they have a similar antennal structure. So they have the handle of the golf club, but then instead of just having kind of like a knob at the top, they have it hooked. So it looks sort of, I don't know, if you look at the club or the knob at the top of the antenna from the side, it sort of looks like a teardrop where it has like a point on the outside edge. And that's, again, one of the defining characteristics of skippers. I can post pictures of these things, again, like I said, in the bug Discord after we're done here. I'm making myself a little sticky note right now to make sure I can post those. Scrolling back. Sorry. All the greenery and the wildflowers, yes. Longtail skipper is your personal favorite. That's a great choice. Oh, Cuttlefish Cuddles? Great. Thanks for putting that in the Discord. We'll check that afterwards. Salty Cajun, that's a really good question. So how do major weather events like hurricanes, which is very timely, affect bugs? Can it cause them to do things that affect us? Just like any animal, or most animals, I guess, that can fly, you see a lot of accidental dispersal after storms. People that like birds will oftentimes go out and do like storm birding because you get really, really crazy things in weird places. So last year when we had that really big hurricane, 26 US states had a record of flamingo last year. I saw my lifer flamingo in Kansas, which is not where they're supposed to be. And them being that far and that spread all the way around the US, I know Michigan had some, I know Pennsylvania had some. Their dispersal last summer and into the fall was basically based on them getting blown off course and blown around by the hurricane. So after hurricanes, you oftentimes find birds out of place. And because people are out looking for them, you oftentimes find birds out of place after a storm. Insects do the same thing. Especially down in like the Florida Keys and along the coast, you do sometimes find weird bugs in weird places after large weather events. Hurricanes, in particular, because they're bringing all of this mass from islands out in the Caribbean and stuff like that up into the US coast. And so you do see that sometimes, but there are many fewer people looking for that sort of thing. And there are very few people that actually have the expertise to go, hey, this is different than what is normally here. So there certainly are records of things down in the Keys, like I said, down in South Florida, that were species from the Caribbean that had been collected after hurricanes. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to establish, right? It could be like a one-off. For it to become a problem, they would have to be able to survive wherever they get introduced to. There would have to be at least one male and at least one female. They would have to find each other. They would have to mate. All this sort of stuff. So it does happen, but I think in terms of compared to the rates that it's reported, It happens way, way, way more frequently than it's actually recorded or reported on. In terms of if it does anything to us, a lot of the times, no. The things that get introduced, like I said, are one-offs, so it would be kind of difficult for it to be something. The odds of it being something super pestiferous or harmful to us are pretty low. But what does affect us, like humans, after particularly hurricanes with big rain events, is mosquitoes. So mosquitoes lay their eggs in water, and then the larvae live in the water, will eventually develop, and then you get adult mosquitoes. And so in Florida and in places where there's all this flooding now as a result of the hurricane, things that don't normally hold water will be holding water. So any stagnant water in like a wheelbarrow or a tire or like the city mailbox that got knocked over during the flood, those can all hold water now, which means that whatever mosquitoes are around have more places to lay their eggs. And after there's been enough time for them to develop, so usually anywhere from like 2 to 3 or 4 weeks, you will have a massive push and a massive kind of explosion in the populations of mosquitoes. And just based on that, there are some human health concerns in terms of like transmitted diseases, things like West Nile and Zika and all of those sorts of things. So indirectly, I would say hurricanes have the potential to be an issue with harmful insects, but not in terms of them blowing in or anything like that, mostly just based on mosquitoes. Oh, you're good, Mick. Don't worry about it. We've got plenty of stuff to talk about, I think. Ooh, Kyrie, I hope I'm saying that right, 44 asked, what is my favorite bug from Australia? That is an excellent question because there is a very fun answer. I don't spend a lot of time working with Australian insects, but one of the really exciting examples is this jewel beetle. The family Buprestidae. And there's one over there that is kind of like an orangey amber color. And I really like this one because for a long time, there was a company in Australia that would make beer. And the beer bottle, when it was empty and, littered on the side of the road, would reflect light in the same way that the beetle wings would. So the elytra, or those hardened front wing covers of the beetles, like I said, were kind of this orange color. I really don't remember off the top of my head what it's called, so I'll have to look and Google, and again, I'll drop it in the Discord when we're done. But the beetles were basically the same color as the beer bottle, or I guess the beer bottles were the same color as the beetles. And people would go out and they would find these jewel beetles trying to mate with the beer bottles that had been discarded on the side of the road. So, like, some of the ways that entomologists and other people that were interested in collecting the insects would go place these beer bottles out, and then the beetles would come in because they were attracted to the color of this beer bottle. Very, very funny. I don't think it ever actually had an impact on populations, or if it was not like a big enough deal that we saw a decline in those beetles. But it was reported, and those beer bottles are in fact not that color anymore because of that. So I would say that is my favorite Australian bug. If I thought about it more, I might come up with a different answer, but I think that is a very exciting and very funny anecdote from down under. Donkus, yes, there we go. Thank you. Gelodimorpha bakewelli. is the jewel beetle that was mating with the beer bottles. So Donkus there left us a very fun link to that. I haven't read it yet. I'll check it, like I said, after we're done here. But who do we have under our hay? I've seen this with glass bottles and burying beetles. Speak on that, Christy. What do you... Like, they've been trying to mate with them? Or you've ended up finding burying beetles in bottles? Because I have an explanation for the second part. I do. So we talked about burying beetles last week. They're the red and black ones that will like bury bits of carrion and dead stuff for their larvae. And so I've seen it. I'm still waiting for Christy there to get back to me, but I've seen an abundance of burying beetles inside of glass bottles, not because the beetles were trying to mate with the bottle or anything like that, but because something else, some other bug, or sometimes a mouse or anything. Yes, okay. It was glass bottle filled and it was all beetles. So, here's my take on that. The carrion beetles were there because there was already dead stuff in the bottle, and they were attracted to the smell of the dead stuff in the bottle. And that ended up becoming kind of like a cyclical process where you had something that died, there was an original set of carrion beetles that would show up, and then sometimes they maybe couldn't get out of the bottle again, and then they would die in there. And then there would be this like process of things getting stuck in the bottle and dying. And I think that's what was happening with when you found this glass bottle full of burying beetles. I don't think the beetles were specifically attracted to the glass bottle in the same way that the ones in Australia were. I think they were there because they were there feeding on other dead stuff in the bottle. So for my master's degree, I put out pitfall traps all across Kansas. And a pitfall trap is basically like a cup in the ground, and you wait for the bugs to fall into it. It's very low tech, but it works great, especially for ground beetles, because they're living on the ground primarily, so they're going to be running around and scurrying through that. However, when I would leave traps out, sometimes it would be like a month to 6 weeks later before I would be able to go get it. And so there was preservative in there to prevent the insects and from the specimens from rotting in there. But sometimes it wouldn't work out super great. And so in pitfall traps where I would have a lot of like in worse shape specimens, so like beetles that had rotted or something like that, I would have so many carrion beetles. And they're very, very highly attracted to the smells of dead things. They've got very, very fine-tuned antennae, so they can pick up on the smell of like rotting dead stuff super, super quick. And definitely where I had beetles that had degraded in the bottom of the trap, those beetles, or those traps, I had definitely more carrion beetles in them than in my other traps. So that is my guess on the beetles in the bottle, but I don't know for sure. But that would be my suggestion. Donkus, can bugs get drunk? Asking the important questions here. Yes. There are lots of insects that are at least attracted to the smells of alcohol. Particularly like forest pests and things that are going to be feeding on like rotting trees and dead wood and stuff like that. There are alcohols and chemicals that things that give off, like when wood is rotting, it gives off the smell of ethanol, which is a type of alcohol. And so to attract those certain beetles, or I guess those beetles are attracted to the smell of alcohol. So they use it in a way. I don't know if this is in the spirit of the answer of the question you were asking, actually. I'll have to I'll have to look to see if there's like alcohol effects on ants or something like that where they stumble around when they've had alcohol. But there are lots of insects that are at least attracted to alcohol, so maybe they like a good beer just like the rest of us. So maybe, like I said, again, not in the spirit of the question you were asking, Donkus, but lots of insects are attracted to alcohol. Some of them, like forest pests, are attracted to like the rotting trees and stuff like that. But there are nitidulids, which are sap feeding beetles, that there's a species that's particularly called the picnic beetle. It's a little black thing with kind of like orange or yellow dots on it. And those ones, they're called picnic beetles because they oftentimes show up at people's picnics. And the best way that I have found to collect those is to leave out a Tupperware container of like wine or beer. People, entomologists that are collecting insects, oftentimes will use fermenting alcohol traps. They'll put bananas, molasses, beer, maybe some wine, kind of let it get nice and bubbly and gross. And you can spread it on like a tree, and moths will come to it because it's a liquid source for them, and it's got those like fruity notes and things like that, like they're coming to feed on a rotten fruit. So yeah, lots of insects are at least attracted to alcohol, but I don't know if they get drunk in the same way. But yeah, Big Al, that's another good point. I definitely did that when I was growing up too, when we were gardening. Slugs are a big problem, particularly for pepper plants, at least in my experience. And what we would used to do for them would be put out like a little pie plate or a Tupperware container or something like that full of beer. And for whatever reason, slugs love a good beer. And so that's a way that people do control slugs in their garden, is by putting out beer for them to get drunk on and then fall into. Are there any bugs that could theoretically do a keg stand? Do I count? How would that work? No, I don't think so. I think man, yeah. I don't think the physics of bugs doing keg stands actually works out very well. Some of like the really, really long walking sticks, like the walking sticks that are like 2 feet long, I think their arms like would, or their front legs would be long enough to stand far enough away to get to like the keg tab. But I don't think that would work out very well. Christy, I know why nitidulids aren't only attracted to smells, because they go into your bee traps. Okay, did I miss anything? Ooh, that's a hard one. I scrolled back a bit. Big Al asked, what bug do you think is the most underrated besides ground beetles? Which was a good caveat because that's absolutely what I would have said. And why? This is hard. My cop-out answer is all of them. As we've talked about, and I know Maya's talked about it, I know Allison's talked about it, we, like, at the bare minimum, want people to appreciate insects. And we are doing as much work as we can to be able to get that to happen. Whether that means like anthropomorphizing them a little bit, talking about Marty and how he's a good cleanup crew and the snake tanks and everything like that. I just want people to care and like bugs a little bit. And so, compared to like the general public, I think all bugs are incredible, or like from the general public's point of view, I think all bugs are honestly super, super underrated. My real answer, I think, and this might be a controversial one here in chat, cockroaches. Cockroaches is my answer. And the reason for that is everyone has that, initial ew, oh my god, gross reaction when you talk about cockroaches. I'm seeing some capital D colons in the chat already. Hear me out. Hear me out. I promise I'm going somewhere with this. So cockroaches, people think about the species that invade your house. They're thinking about German cockroaches. They're thinking about American cockroaches. They're thinking about the ones that are like household pests. In reality, that is a minuscule fraction of what that group actually entails. So I was talking to somebody that worked on cockroaches at the big bug meeting a couple years ago. They gave a phenomenal talk, incredibly interesting, and they said that there's about 4,000 species of cockroaches worldwide, and there's less than a dozen of them that are like actual pests in human houses. And what he said next was incredibly profound, and he said that if you were to go out and try to meet 4,000 people, it is almost guaranteed that more than 12 of them would piss you off. So cockroaches are actually doing pretty okay. And I think that's a phenomenal way to think about it. We've talked about why insects are vilified so much, and a lot of it's because somebody had a bad interaction with them at some point. They were stung by ants, they got stung by a bee, they had cockroaches in their house, they had bed bugs when they were younger, they had head lice, whatever it might be. Those negative interactions with insects make up like an immensely small number of the interactions that people could be having with insects if they were out like looking for them a little bit more. So cockroaches are really, really, really cool because there are so many species that don't get into your house, and the ones in the tropics are beautiful. You have these metallic ones with bright yellow spots. You've got ones that look like ladybugs. You've got blue ones. You've got green ones. You've got brown ones that are like 3 inches long. Cockroach diversity is really, really exciting. And they're just chilling and cleaning things up. The ones in your house, yes, they can be a problem. But the other 3,988 whatever species of cockroaches on the planet are decomposers. They're breaking down leaf litter, they're breaking down soil and wood in the forest. They're doing processes that really, really help the environment. And so of the ones that are like super vilified and people don't like right off the bat, I think cockroaches are my standout for the ones that are the most underrated. So that's my answer, yes. Funfettisburg, I love to hear that. Bugs are friends. Severe Valkyrie, Alveus made me into a bug activist. Love to hear it. I cooked. Okay. Appreciate you guys. Dolphins, squirrels. Okay, questions. Is there something about arthropods that prevents them from reaching larger mammalian sizes? We seem to have had big bugs before. Yes, so atmospheric conditions. And just body size. So there's this thing called like the surface area to volume ratio that insects have a very, very high surface area to low volume. Yeah, okay. That makes them be able to do their thing. Insect exoskeletons are like armor. And if you've never seen like some of the really massive beetles, there is an upper limit of how big things can be, because otherwise they would not be able to hold up their own body, basically, because they're too heavy with how thick their exoskeletons are. In the past, we had higher atmospheric oxygen, which would allow them to be able to make oxygen penetrate their bodies further. And insects don't breathe through their mouth like we do. They don't have lungs. They have trachea, which connect to these little openings on the side of the body called spiracles. And so these spiracles are basically little holes that have tubes connected to them that go down into the body. But because insects don't have a closed circulatory system, so like when we breathe in, the oxygen goes to our lungs and it eventually oxygenates the blood, and we pump that around with our heart. Insects don't have veins or anything like that to directly transport blood. All of their hemolymph is what it's called, is the term for insect blood, is just kind of floating around in there. And so they do have, like with the dorsal nerve cord and everything like that, they do have a thing that functions like a heart that helps circulate that hemolymph, but they don't have any way to directly oxygenate it. So they have these big tubes that go down into various parts of the body, and just as the hemolymph is passing over those tracheal tubes is how they pick up the oxygen to be able to do their bug thing. And so back in the day when we had a lot of higher atmospheric oxygen, they could get that oxygen to transport further down into those tracheal tubes. And so we did have things like Meganeura, which is probably the giant bugs you're thinking of, like the dragonflies with 2.5, 3 foot wingspans. But dragonflies were also some of the earliest evolving insects. We never had beetles that were like massive like that. And that's partially due to how thick and heavy their exoskeletons would get. Okay, back to cockroaches. Do they only move into messy, dirty homes, or can you just get roaches because they want to move in? They absolutely can just move in. However, they're exploring parts of your home that you don't think about a lot. So, like, behind the stove and behind your refrigerator, I could not tell you the last time that I pulled my stove out to vacuum up all the crumbs that I've dropped back there while I was cooking. And the same thing with my refrigerator. Just stuff builds up back there because it's not an area that we clean often. And so if you do have cockroaches and you feel like you keep a relatively clean house, it could be those other portions of your house that you don't get to see very often. So they can just move in, but sometimes there is also an underlying problem that you might not know about. Okay, my cams got cut. We're back at looking at the frog pond, so that must mean it's 10 o'clock and time for me to go. Ladybug 2 last night. Everybody's just catching up real quick before we head off. Big Al googled prettiest cockroaches. Love that. Love to see it. All right, all. I'm going to head off for the night. Appreciate you, as always, for being here. I appreciate all of our cam ops tonight. Mick, Logan, whoever was driving. I appreciate you all for being here. I appreciate Alveus for letting me come talk to you guys every other week or so. I will post a bunch of stuff in the bug Discord. There's a command for that now. It's just !bugcord. So come over there if you have other questions. I'm in there during the week as well, so if you have a very pressing question that can't wait until next Wednesday, we can take care of it there. But thank you, everyone. Have a nice night. Enjoy the night cams, and I will talk to you soon.